Hi everyone, welcome to Scare It Bennett. I'm Hannah Neal, and this summer I've had the privilege of working with Reverend Kelly, the director of our racial justice ministries here at Scare It Bennett. Scare It Bennett is so much more than a place that champions justice. Formerly home to United Methodist related Scare It College for Women, today we're constantly working to preserve the legacy of Scare It women while fighting for women's empowerment, racial and social justice, and dignity for all. The Racial Justice Ministries has created a series where we hold vital discussions on some of the most pressing issues today. This series, called Conversations at the Intersection, today we're seeking to understand the role of violence in oppressed communities. Jack and I spent a few days thinking about what our society looks like today, and we came to the conclusion that we often fail to discuss the power of self-defense to protect the most marginalized in society. Today, we're seeking to understand what violence as a form of self-defense looks like and why it's justified. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jack. I'll begin this panel by introducing the panelists. If you could save your applause until after all the panelists have been introduced, that'd be great. And I'll start from right here with Tyler Pridgen. He's a private security professional and the chief of staff at the Fred Hampton Gun Club Tennessee chapter. He owns a private security company and is a firearms enthusiast who uses his experience to train black families and share the importance of firearms for self-defense and their place in the revolutionary struggle. Tanea McClean is a mother, entrepreneur, community caregiver, and human being with guns. She is a certified training counselor and firearms instructor for the United States Concealed Carry Association and assistant pistol instructor and range safety officer with the NRA. She founded Surreal Self-Defense in late 2019, a business designed to empower women to be knowledgeable and safe with firearms and also share alternative self-defense techniques to ensure the safety of some of our community's most vulnerable citizens. In 2020, she gathered with a few like-minded community members, and together they founded the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club, where she serves a position as president. Denzel Caldwell is a community organizer, economist, martial arts teacher, and certified firearms instructor. A native of Nashville, he currently serves as the sergeant-at-arms for the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club, as well as the founder of Dynastic Arts, his martial arts and firearms training business. He has over 16 years of martial arts training, as well as 5 years of firearms experience. Denzel graduated from Morehouse College in 2014, magna cum laude, with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics, and from the University of Oklahoma in 2018 with his Master's of Arts in Economics. Since 2018, he has been organizing with formations such as the Nashville Economic Justice Alliance, the Nashville People's Budget Coalition, and the Black Nashville Assembly. And Dr. Sekou Franklin, who is not here at the moment but will be soon, is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Middle Tennessee State University. He is the author of After the Rebellion, Black Youth Social Movement Activism in the Post-Civil Rights Generation, and edited The State of Blacks in Middle Tennessee. He also has an upcoming book called Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. All right, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Good evening. Thank you for coming and being here, and I want to thank my interns. They have been amazing this summer, Hannah Neal and Jack, and the work that they have done, and actually coming up with this topic, doing the research, putting the questions together, and helping me to put together this panel. So I'm very excited about what we're going to do on tonight. I'm thankful for you all to be here. I look forward to Sekou arriving soon. I know he will. I'm not worried about it at all. The only thing is, the first question I have is for him, so I'm going to ask somebody else. I'm going to ask all of you all this question, and hopefully he'll get in on it soon, or not, I don't know. So the real question, as we're talking about this idea about when is violence justified, or is violence or justified and on the side of the oppressed, the real question that I want to know is, what is violence? Does it go beyond physical brutality? And I really want us to consider this quote from Kwame Ture that says, is it not violent for a child to go to bed hungry in the richest country in the world? I think that is violent. But that type of violence is so institutionalized that it becomes a part of our way of life. Not only do we accept poverty, we even find it normal. And that again becomes the oppressor makes that is because the oppressor makes his violence a part of the functioning society. And so, that was Dr. Franklin. To get back to him. So I really want you all to define violence for us, and also in its many forms as we deal with this. And I'll let you start wherever.
Well, I'll start. With some of the work that I do, I work with addicts, those that are addicted to drugs. And drugs have become a way that people in all different societies and cultures turn to cope with those things that we name like hunger, poverty, abuse, you name mental health issues. And those are things that a lot of the people that end up addicted on drugs, they can't afford to go to a mental health therapist, or they don't have those type of services provided in the community that they're in. I live in rural Tennessee, so we deal with again, there's a huge meth problem in that area, which also there's a huge trafficking problem. In Coffee County, the trafficking problem is a reflection of the drug problem, because these people, kids aren't coming up missing, they're exchanging their children for their habit. When they get caught up in that, or they're having these babies and they're born with drugs in their system, those babies are snatched from their mothers. I mean, immediately. So to me, that's a form of violence, when families are being broken up, and especially because of all these other issues we talk about, which leads to an addiction, which leads to broken families. So I believe that's definitely a form of violence that we encounter here in our society.
Yes.
I don't mind going next. So I would like to start off with a fundamental definition of violence being, on a micro level, when one person or being enacts harm or pain onto another being or thing. And for me, that definition is useful, because for that I can talk about interpersonal violence. But what I can also do with that definition and that framing is also scale it up to talk about how bodies of people or institutions can enact pain or harm onto another institution or a group of people, right? And so this is where my understanding of structural violence comes into play. Whether we're talking about things like national borders, where because there is this border, this enacted or defined border based on a country, that violence is used to enforce that actual boundary. Whether we're talking about laws that are put in place for society to shape behavior, and whenever that behavior is deviant, violence is used to correct, quote unquote, that behavior. And so for me, I think about harm or pain being enacted on a being or body of people, or even an institution, by a being, a group of people, or another institution.
So it's about harm in particular. Brother Ty?
So yeah, I'd like to agree with what Brother Denzel said in his definition of violence. I believe at its basic definition is one individual or a group inflicting pain or harm onto another individual or group. So I think that plays a lot into the reason we're discussing this panel when it comes to violence, and also, self-defense. How do we define self-defense in our society? What do we say to the oppressed people? What is too much in regards to retaliating for what's been done to your communities? What's too much? And then who has the power to define self-defense to those communities after they've been, brutalized and harmed and treated very poorly for, so many centuries? So I just want to, bring a question into it. If we say what is violence, then also, what is our definition of self-defense? That's something we can think about also.
That was actually, thank you, because I was about to begin to move in that direction. Before we, welcome. I'm so glad that you were able to make it. I understand it, doing all the things that we can do. Yes, well, we can move to that. Like, what? We're trying to figure out what's what. Now I'm going to.
Yeah, I'm just turning mine off.
I'm going to turn it off. We'll see what happens. Once again,
That's violence. This microphone.
I have now turned off my phone.
My
No,
phone is off
it's
as
not.
well.
Did mine too.
I turned mine off. We'll see if it's me.
Mine is
Laptop.
off as well.
Your tablet.
Could that be it? Oh, man. Okay, thank you. Since you brought it up, how do you define self-defense? And I would also add, what is the difference between, what would you say is the difference between violence and self-defense?
The difference between violence and self-defense. I think Minister Malcolm X had a great quote when he spoke on self-defense. He said, "I don't call it violence, I call it intelligence." It's always a funny question when it's panels like this, when it's the marginalized groups. We ask them, is it a radical question to say what is self-defense? Did we ask America, was it self-defense with Pearl Harbor? Was that even a logical question, or was it pretty much, did it even need to be asked? So when it comes to our communities, that plays back into what I said is, who is the master to tell us what is too much? So me, I'm a firearms carrier. So from that perspective of legalities, self-defense is justified when someone is causing us or someone around us bodily harm that could lead to death. So from a dictionary definition or from law, that is their definition of self-defense. We could play that into politics also. We need to ask ourselves, how much is too much? And when do we eventually stand up? I think a good thing would be studying different revolutions from all throughout history. At what point, how much did those people tolerate before they said it's time to organize? It's time to study what we need to do to find our liberation. So for me, I would just say, like Minister Malcolm said, self-defense is just intelligence. It's protecting your own self. What's the first law of the universe? Self-preservation. So no one is in their right to tell you you don't have the right, to defend yourself. So that's my definition.
I would like to hear your stance on that, Sekou.
Can you rephrase the question on the question for him, or you want a different?
I think similar. The question that we were dealing with when you enter was defining what is violence, and so an opportunity for you to provide input on that point, and then also how would you define self-defense as a practitioner of nonviolence?
Well, violence probably is the use of, probably conceived as a use of force to achieve, looking at political, social, and economic objectives and aims. It could also be the use of force or coercion to exercise domination over someone. Nonviolence also has coercive tactics too. So, violence in the United States, particularly racialized violence, it's reinforced by social norms and standards. So it's almost assumed that we're birthed into nonviolence. I'm sorry, it's almost assumed that we're birthed into nonviolence, and then somehow it's kind of a misreading of the movements and stuff. Somehow we maybe do a trajectory towards violence, but in actuality we're birthed into violence, especially in the South.
You're figuring it out.
Especially in the South, which has a culture of violence. So the basic norms and standards as important as physical violence. And that's why people like Martin Luther King Jr., Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, they always spoke about the need to combat racial inferiority, that white supremacy operates with the fuel of racial inferiority. So King speaks to, say, for example, kids in Philadelphia, gang members in Chicago, Fanon, Fannie Lou Hamer, they're trying to combat also racial inferiority because it's part of the psychological warfare. But then the third form of violence, which is reflective, I think, I think I heard somebody refer to Kwame Ture's quote, that's what's called structural violence. And structural violence is operating in a racial caste system. It's systemic poverty. And in the movement, if you go through, and I'm talking about the movement that's not on CNN. Some of the movement history that's not on Hollywood, and Hollywood being funded by me. But some of the movement that I've seen pouring through literally thousands and thousands of archives. In the movement, it was clear whether you're talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, Kwame Ture, Martin Luther King Jr. If you look at his speeches, structural violence was as problematic as physical violence. So those three: physical, psychological, and structural violence. Are how I would define violence. In terms of self-defense, are you saying it's illegitimate?
Just how would you define it? What would you consider it?
Well, there's self-defense that could be armed self-defense, is what you're talking about. And armed self-defense could be defined through multiple ways. There's organized armed self-defense. There, in which people are literally organizing as part of a organizing process. There's self-defense that's not just organizing armed, but it's ideological. And so, and this goes back to the Panther Party, where the Panther Party started out as a Black Panther Party for self-defense, quote unquote. But people like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and others, if you really kind of dig deep, were concerned that people were pouring into the Panther Party, teenagers, and they were concerned about the hat, the jacket, and the gun. They call it the jackanate theory. And they weren't concerned about the ideology, where Huey Newton and them were studying Fanon and Mao Zedong, and maybe I can go on, Brene Jabay. So what the Panther Party, at least the key members from the West Coast, which is I'm more familiar with, they were concerned that armed defense comes with ideology, and that it's an ideological struggle. And so you can have, for example, people picking up arms, but if they're not anchored in an ideological struggle, then it effectively just becomes them just shooting guns and not knowing anything about why they're shooting guns. So some of the Panthers, like Huey Newton and them, wanted, I think if I'm correct, some of the people close to them wanted to just call themselves a Black Panther Party because they were a political party that had an ideological struggle, so to speak. And then there's interpersonal forms of self-defense. There's people who believe in, maybe I'm speaking too long, but there's people who believe in what's called principled versus pragmatic nonviolence. Principled nonviolence is someone, Gandhi, morally committed to nonviolence. Pragmatic nonviolence would be somebody saying, well, I believe in nonviolence and the strategies and the tactics, but a kid in Soweto's probably not going to be able to fend off a tank rolling through Soweto that's being backed by the West. So there may be pragmatically committed to nonviolence, but in the movement per se, and I'll just close off with this, in the movement, then you had people that believed in nonviolence, but they understood that the landowner owned land in Mississippi, or the person that they were with, maybe didn't believe in that, or they had people who said, I believe in nonviolence as a political motive, but if somebody comes and punches me, then maybe I can take it, but if they punch my daughter, no. So there's different variations within this process of so-called armed defense, and I'll speak this last part. And then there's armed defense or armed struggle, or self-defense rather, that's birthed out of what we think but maybe not, spontaneous rebellions. The urban rebellions, for example, the 60s and 70s. We say we think they're spontaneous because they're probably more politically motivated by state violence. And there I would refer you to this new work by Elizabeth Hinton. I have some disagreements with the work, but it's a great book on urban rebellions of the 60s and 70s.
Thank you.
framing.
Thank you. That was helpful, and I find myself stuck in a place right now because I want to go one place, but I think before we can go to the next place that I want to go, I think it's important that we defined who, when we say the oppressed, who exactly are we speaking of? Who do we speak of when we say the oppressed? And that's for you, Tanea.
I look at those that don't have the means to protect their resources, especially the resources that play a part in self-preservation, or they have a fear of protecting this because of legal punishment or harsh punishments that comes with making that decision. Those that are not expected to respond to violence with violence or not expected to defend themselves. Going back to the definition of self-defense, for me, it's a mental thing. It's processing what's going on. My tagline for my business is self-defense is self-love in action. We speak on self-respect, self-love, self-image, all those things, but very seldom, especially as women, do we focus on self-defense. And self-defense is a strategy for self-preservation. So those that don't have a strategy to preserve themselves, their families, their community, are an oppressed people. Those whose power is not valued or respected is definitely an oppressed people. So back to that term violence, violence is, to me, is just a tool. You know, it's a tool that can be used as a part of your strategy for self-preservation, which is self-defense, which is self-love in action.
I like it. So I'm thinking about these 3 types of violence that Dr. Sekou, yeah, he told me to call him Sekou.
Just call me Sekou.
He told me to call him. And I'm thinking about these 3 types: this physical, interpersonal violence that's happening, this psychological violence that is telling you that you are not worthy of anything, you are less than human, and that being violent to your own personal psyche and way of being of self, and then also this institutionalized violence that places you and your people in a particular place and does not allow you to break out of this box, whether it is economically, whether it's educationally, all the different things that then are in the institution in order to keep you oppressed. And I am wondering, when it comes to self-defense, and I'm looking at this question, but I have a different question. How then do you determine when the self-defense response is as violent or less violent as the violence that is being inflicted upon you? Like, how do you determine between that?
So for me, I'm not a believer of the idea of objectivity.
Okay.
I believe that that there's always a particular perspective, in this case politic, that frames how we look at a thing. So for me, when we talk about this question of what I'm hearing at least is, when is a certain use of force legitimate? I guess my question then would have to be, who gets to create the standard by which we measure legitimacy, right? So for me, when I think of self-defense in this case, and if we accept the definition, particularly Sekou's framing of violence, then the question becomes, why is it that acts of politicized self-defense are deemed as legitimate or othered in a way that is a response to a daily, oftentimes invisible, and sometimes, depending on the flashpoint, visible forms of violence, right? Why is it that we are questioning an oppressed group of people who are deciding to organize to maintain life and self-preservation, while we have an entire global police force, i.e. the U.S. military, with over 1,000 military bases across the planet, right, and able to enact violence on certain individuals and groups of people that don't fall within its political line, for lack of better terms, right? And so for me, it's always about who has control of the narrative and who has control of the framing, and that will, for me, would determine how self-defense is seen as or as not legitimate. And so for me, this also brings up this question of quote-unquote justice. And so for me, I think back to the Latin root of that, which roughly, and it's been a while since I've done Latin, but it talks about enacting the will of the law. But for my question with that is, what happens as far as like the will of the law when the law does not see you as human, or as, in this case, in a societal sense, a citizen, or as property, right? Then to me, in my mind, then there can be no justice under that structure, no matter how you define your reasoning for engaging in self-defense under that structure. So as long as you use that language or that standard as a form of legitimacy, then it'll never be sufficient. And this may actually sound very controversial, what I'm about to say, but for me, my desire to engage in self-defense does not come from a 200-plus-year-old piece of paper that says I have the right to defend myself. It comes from the Africans who engaged in Stono Rebellion, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, the countless black Civil War veterans that fought in small-scale wars to defend themselves against early white supremacist groups during the nadir of American history, during Reconstruction, the Black Panther Party, the grandmamas who had to have a shotgun to keep beside their bed so they could chase away the Klan to keep their kids safe, right? Or the people, or the black folks today who feel that they need to organize to create a gun club like our own in order to keep ourselves and each other safe from both interpersonal and structural violence. So for me, it's all about being in control of the language and the parameters in which we define legitimacy, notions of violence, and being, honestly.
Before I move, anyone have any? He said it.
He said it.
Okay. So I have a question, and this is not on the paper. I have a question because these three pieces of violence is really helpful for me, because there's a need, whatever that violence looks like, in order for folks to be free, you have to stop the violence, right? And I am wondering, what is the correlation between, I know that when we think about the, is it Red, it's not Red Summer, 1963, when they are in Mississippi getting people to register to vote, and they start freedom schools, right? That is a direct response to the violence that is happening to the children and to the adults, that they're not having their right to vote. And so in that, there is political education that is happening, both for adults, to getting them to go vote, as well as letting the children just be loved on. What does it mean just to love on folks? And how that then disrupts their violence. And as they're doing this work, a decade later, we've got the Panthers doing the work of also making sure that folks got food, the children have food before they go to school. They're also organizing in different cities around doing health clinics, because while still walking around holding those shotguns. And I'm wondering about how these two get these different forms, how these different forms of self-defense, both the physical holding of a gun and walking down the street and saying, I see you, police, seeing me, see you. I need you to see that I see you, see me, right? As well as putting food on tables for folks who don't have the capacity. How these two align. Well, I get how they align, but why is it that it doesn't, why are these stories been told differently than that which we are often felt? And I'm interested in Your eyes look very bright over there, Brother Ty.
Appreciate it.
And so I'm interested in your thoughts around that.
Speak on that last portion again.
I'm gonna go. All of us, except for you, we didn't get a chance to have a
Do
conversation.
you want me to hit more on why I feel like the narrative is shifted and why that's not?
Why the narrative of when an organization decides that they are also going to pick up a gun in addition to the other work that they're also doing, how that gets shifted into something that is all bad, even when it is the seed for a national government program that runs till this day.
Yeah.
Right?
I got you.
So that's what I'm interested in.
Especially, I guess, America. When you wear the title of the free world, the free nation, it's embarrassing to know that you have a group, which I know you're talking about with women, infants, and children, or also the free breakfast program,
free breakfast,
which led
free
into
lunch.
free lunch. So for those who don't know, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense back in the 60s saw the need that in Oakland, and this is nationwide, worldwide, children were going to bed hungry. They were waking up hungry, and it was affecting their test scores. It was showing that when they're hungry, they can't process thoughts as clearly. They just aren't as sharp, very grumpy. No child wants to be hungry. So what the Panthers did, they created the free breakfast program before school every day. You come get free food. So being America, this is a country of illusion. A lot of the things we portray worldwide, this country may not, really even stand on. So it's embarrassing to know that, we're telling the world, this is the free world. Everything's good, yet you've got children here who are starving, literally in D.C. You got so much poverty right down the street from the White House. So that's a big thing, embarrassment. I know, too, just to kind of hit on what you were saying in the beginning, I feel like these programs, like with the Panthers, everything that we're doing, those are survival programs. So the whole purpose of those programs is to say, eventually we need to get ourselves to a point where we have our own government. This is functioning, but for the time being, we need to do what we can to make sure our people survive. So with the Panthers, started off as on patrol units, surveying the police department in Oakland, making sure, a lot of black men, women even, being murdered. Especially back then, there's no cell phones, nobody to account for it. So you just got a police officer's word and you've got a dead black individual. So that's how the Panthers were born, but out of them being born through that, mind you, what the doctor said, which was a great point, it was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. A lot of people leave that out. They want to criminalize them because they're saying it's the white guilt complex. It's the Negroes with the guns. Because when we have the guns and we've had the power, we know what we've done with those. We know what we've done to your people. So because of that, when we see you pick up the gun, we feel the guilt. Now we feel, are those guns going to be turned on me and my community the same way we turn them on yours? When we speak about white self-defense, it's self-defense. Again, I'll go back to the point with Pearl Harbor. Nobody saw that as an issue when America said, it's time to put your boots on and strap up. It's time to go to war. No, they came to your homeland and they disrupted it. So I find it funny when black individuals, we can just talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma. They tell us, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. Where your communities at? Look what you did to our communities when we pulled ourselves up, when we said, okay, we're going to segregate. We got to have our security force. So why is it that when it comes to black groups, our security forces are criminalized? We're looked at as something other than a self-defense unit. So I don't know if I kind of got away from
No, you didn't.
Can I add?
Okay, go for it.
Since you brought up the Panther Party for self-defense, it goes back to what I said originally when you asked who are the oppressed. I said those that don't have the means to protect their resources.
Yes.
But the Panther Party showed we're going to protect these resources. So these programs that we have for the kids, yes, we're coming with our guns and our rifles and let you know if you come over here and you run up, you get done up, because these are our babies, which is our community and our future and our legacy. These are our resources. We want to feed these babies since you're not doing a job at it. But then again, I look at it like it wasn't their job to do it anyways. It was our community's job to feed our children. And to his point too, but when we show that we can do these things, then we get attacked. Then here comes white supremacy, or here comes gentrification, or here comes whatever, to break that up. So then what does it do? It takes the fight out of you. You know what I mean? It makes you just say it's easier to just submit and go with what they have than to stand up and fight. They don't expect you to respond to violence with violence. That's what being oppressed is. But the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the black gun clubs said, nah, that's not what we're doing. We will fight back. You know, we might even start some fill in the blank with a cuss word, you know. So, because we can't introduce violence into a racial social system. It's already there. It's will we challenge it is the question.
I'd like to add on to this too. To your question about how those things are connected, I think it all goes back to what Sekou talked about, is the ideology behind the firearms and the organization. I'd like to start off by saying that I often reject this sort of dichotomy that's placed between violent and nonviolent organizing, because these are methods that are being used towards liberating, in this case, black people from these structurally violent conditions. And so I really do think, again, we have to go back to that question: who is framing these questions? Who is defining the language such that we are creating these dichotomies between two wings of a movement that seeks to liberate black people from these oppressive conditions? Now, granted, I know that there are differing philosophies, and differing even political objectives, right? We talked about the Black Panther Party, who was reading Mao Zedong, very much so a leftist organization. I think they, and correct me if I'm wrong, they were originally revolutionary nationalists, and then they moved towards more of a intercommunalism, right? And so, like, we're thinking about that in opposition to...
You made the doctor very happy right now.
No.
Yeah.
Most people don't know.
Right.
People, they know the
Like-
revolutionary nationalism, but they don't know the revolutionary communalism.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like thinking about, like,
Which was the first critique of globalization, by the way.
Right, exactly. So, like,
Yeah,
thinking
but
about the political ideologies that undergird these things are important, because I believe it was Mao Zedong that said, he talked about, like, essentially paying attention to the politic that guided the gun, right? So, and to me, that's what differentiates between a reactionary, somebody who understands that this violence is happening and engaging in self-defense, but not necessarily questioning the politic by which they engage in that self-defense, or somebody who we would call a revolutionary, that not only has an analysis about the violence and understands the need to react to this violence, but is doing so in a way to intentionally enact a new political reality and social reality. And so for me, to answer your question, we have to question that whole notion of separating violence and nonviolence, because to me, I feel like that's a tool of the state in order to legitimize what is considered legitimate response to structural violence created by the state, or something that is considered violence, which, if we look at it during, like, the time and look at the geopolitical conditions, they were seen as a threat to the state because they had certain political ideologies that aligned with the U.S.'s international opponents. And so some of which the legacy of which we still see today, right? And so for me, it's also about the politics that undergird the action. And so when you think about the politics that guide those things, it's easier to see why the Panthers were able to engage in self-defense, but then also provide free breakfast programs, free medical as well, and then other forms of care that's informed by more socialist politics. Yeah.
So,
I respond if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
I do want to make sure I get it. At least I do want to offer, maybe later on, some of the challenges with using armed resistance. I know I'm probably a minority on the panel, but I want to.
Throw it on there.
But beyond that,
That's why you're here.
maybe later I can do that. But I do want to respond to your question. Sorry. And the freedom schools, the citizenship schools. I'm doing a project right now on the citizenship schools. Those were what Gandhi referred to as constructive programs. And I want to emphasize this point because in the broader nonviolent trainings that that are more modernized today. Then there's a section on constructive programs. A constructive program basically is a program that promulgates community self-sufficiency and parallel organizations, with the understanding that a community can operate in such high-intensity repression that constructive programs may be the best thing that's operative. And in the Salt March of Gandhi, women particularly were making silk for many of the villagers and protesters. Why was that important? Because the villagers were forced to buy clothing from the British. So Gandhi, I think, made the argument in at least the early 1930s that he thought constructive programs were more effective in the tradition of nonviolence than civil disobedience. So if you fast forward, and I don't know if he's correct, but if you fast forward to the 60s and you look at the citizenship schools in which at least 8,000 people, working class people, many of them, came out of the citizen schools, first started by September Clark, then taken over by the SCLC, and 4 to 5 principal leaders of the schools, Dorothy Cotton, Bernice Robinson, September Clark, and Annelle Ponder, were women. And they were the ones that went back to the local communities, and Fannie Lou Hamer came out of the schools. In fact, Fannie Lou Hamer, the main beating that Fannie Lou Hamer got was coming out of citizen schools, freedom schools, and then even before the survival programs, what's not talked about enough is SCLC, SNCC, and affiliate groups were developing farmer cooperatives, credit unions. Some of the citizen school folks called them crash programs. This is before '66, and so, but we think of constructive programs as being outside of nonviolence, but the principal voices of the movement saw them as part of nonviolence resistance, going back to the definition provided by Gandhi. And this goes back to the Panthers. There is a deeper history with the Panthers, and sometimes people who carry arms may decide at some point that it might be more useful not to emphasize carrying arms. And there was some discussion in the Oakland Panthers, at least I think with either Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, that survival programs in a way that may be more important than us carrying guns. And I don't want to just gloss over this, because this caused a vicious fight with Eldridge Cleaver, and in which partly triggered by the killing of Bobby Hutton, in which Eldridge Cleaver, I shouldn't say this publicly, but Bobby Hutton got the bullet, and Eldridge Cleaver went to New York and Nigeria and claimed revolution. But when the shooting started, little Bobby Hutton got the bullet. The first person to ever join the Panther as a teenager. And so what Huey Newton and them said was that working class black folks are probably you're gonna win them over by the survival program, so to speak. And that may be more important than so-called armed defense. So sometimes, definitely, sometimes, I just read Bob Moses's book, some SNCC members by 65 had guns in their seats, and Bob Moses is saying, nonviolent. I know you got a gun in your seat, but that's the way the game is. But at the same time, there are some folks who came out of the Panther Party who said, this is not a game, so the survival programs is important. So sometimes converts from nonviolence can be made into armed. Gloria Richardson, sometimes people that take up arms can be converted to this for a lot of different reasons. There's a more complicated story and history, and it's not like linear. It's not like the Hollywood movies. It's struggling with your beliefs daily. So daily is daily. It's the impurity. I'm going on, but I'm sorry. But even like the Poor People's Campaign, if you look at, there was a dialectic between the urban rebellions of 1966, 67, 68 and the Poor People's Campaign. That Poor People's Campaign, if you read King's speeches, he's directly saying we need a Poor People's Campaign to respond to the structural violence.
Exactly.
But there's a dialectic too.
Yeah.
right? It's a dialectic. They forced King in many respects. I would argue, I'm sure people would disagree with me, maybe they forced King to do the Poor People's Campaign. So even when I'm staunch nonviolence, whatever. I try not to be moralistic, hitting people in the head with it, everything like that. But the way I kind of see it is that the cries in the street, whatever they may be, if they're violence, they force us who believe in nonviolence not only to sharpen our thinking, but to have to respond to the objective conditions that people are facing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way I kind of operate and move. But I would like it later on to respond to that earlier thing.
I appreciate all that you all have said, because you said some different things that lead me to this next question. Ty, you talked about creation of own separate government and being able to fully govern, and black folks being able to have their own government to fully govern themselves. And as well as talking about, and I'm gonna say it just kind of across the board, how then do we empower folks to be able to take care of themselves? So Tanea talking about, like, we should be able to feed ourselves. We should be able to. And if they're doing these farm collectives and helping folks, all of these things that are happening, and we've seen what the response to when black folks have been self-sufficient, it has been violence to destroy that. And in many ways, in order to maintain the definition imposed upon black folks through white supremacy, that when we are living to the fullness of humanity, that there's a need to take that down. And so I'm hearing that across the board. And my question around this is, how does white fear guide the need for black self-defense? I
don't mind starting. Well, I wouldn't even start at white fear. I would even go far as, like, say it's the construct of whiteness itself. Right? Because if we go, and I want to quote Professor Gerald Horne in his Dawn of the Apocalypse, where he talks about the formation of whiteness in the 16th century, and he talks about these various Western countries building this sort of pan-European identity that was used to justify and expand their power after warring with each other for hundreds and hundreds of years, only to land in the Western Hemisphere, in the African continent, to impose the violence that was imposed within the continent or within the construct of what we call Europe. For me, you got to start there, right? Because from there, this is when you start to get these notions of the other. So instead of it, at the time, it was sort of like this religious sort of identification, sort of what we would call Islamophobia, even these sort of like conflicts within Christianity, right? But then over time, as you start to see this colonial project reach the Western Hemisphere, the African continent with the African slave trade, you start to see that othering become racialized. Right? And so for me, this fear that we're talking about, a specific of black self-defense, is the colonial fear, or sort of like the colonial fear that the chickens will come home to roost, right? And so whether it's a black individual deciding to pick up a gun to respond to an interpersonal situation, all the way up into organized black armed resistance, or whether it be domestic or international or Pan-African in nature, right? That is always a fear, because that undermines not only this empire and this current global structure, but even that construct of whiteness. Because I would argue in so many ways that construct, that racialized construct, is birthed in violence, right? When we talk about who gets to be within this construct and who doesn't, and we see historically what has been on the outskirts of that construct we call whiteness. We see death, destruction. We see the expropriation of land. We see the destruction of peoples and whole historical memories. We see even destruction within that identity, right? Because no longer is it German, Swedish, French. It's this amalgamation of whiteness with a contracted and brought together by essentially structural violence, right? So for me, to answer the question, it's white fear. That's a subset of the problem, right? And so for me, what for us, I think it's the fear the empire has of its own destruction, right? And so. That's where my mind went when you brought up that question.
What you got to add?
Yeah, I got a little bit to add to that. So for anyone who pays attention to the news, a couple of months ago, we had the mass shooting in Buffalo. I don't know who all got to check out the shooter's manifesto, but if you ever get the chance, Google Buffalo mass shooter's manifesto. His whole basis on why he attacked that supermarket and killed 10 black individuals is the white replacement theory. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but there was a psychiatrist. She had a piece got very popular in the 80s. Her name is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Her theory is the white genetic inferiority complex, which is that genetically, white is a recessive. It's recessive in DNA. She has a theory that the number one weapon on this planet, it's not firearms, it's not bombs, but it's in fact the penis of the black male. And that is because black males have the power to impregnate and birth their race within any womb. So I would be afraid too if genetically I knew that if 100 of my women and 100 of your men could go into an island, and in one generation my race would be completely wiped out, and you did not commit not one act of violence. So if you check out his manifesto, that's pretty much what it's based around. It's based around the fact that I know that genetically I'm dying off as a breed. Another point I want to hit on with that is that the need for just black, I guess you said the need for black training and black self-defense.
Oh, how does white fear guide the need for black self-defense?
From my perspective, that's in knowing that that's not the last attack. That's not the last one. It's not going to stop. If we look at, in history, we looked at through Jim Crow and the lynchings. It all plays a part. We ask ourselves, why were black males castrated? That's the exact reason for our genetic inferiority. So if you play that into part, you know that this level of racism isn't going anywhere. So we as black individuals have to understand the need for training, training on an organized level, getting in those groups, your black self-defense units, and understanding that Buffalo isn't the last attack of racism. It's not. Seriously, I want everybody to check that out. Check out that the reason he did what he did. Study that ideology, and it'll open your eyes to a lot of things, and you'll start to understand what truly is racism. Why is black skin hated? So, yeah, I'd say that's the need from my perspective.
Y'all got me sitting here thinking, and I've got some questions that I don't have yet the capacity to articulate. But I'm wondering about that as well, and I guess really what I'm thinking about, the capacity to combat the fears of others and how. Yeah, this is really my thought here. I'm sorry, I had a different thought. It's not written down. Well, my thought is, what happens when, as we think about self-defense, when we can be the capacity for us to be overtaken by the fears of others. So on the flip side of that, and how much then do we then get caught up in the I hate to use that word, hysteria. It's a horrible word. But just the caught up nature of the extreme thoughts that others might have. and that can take us out to the margins, especially within a society that is concerned about setting up hierarchy, right? That hierarchy is important. If we're constantly trying to climb a hierarchy, then that creates an opportunity for separation and destruction. So while that idea might be present, how then do we protect our own mental health, our own personal understanding of what it means, while not always, in order to not always look for the, I don't know if this, to always looking for the outlier, always looking for that one person who might walk into a grocery store, that one person who might walk into a church, because it's a possibility. I remember what it was like sitting and watching the news when after Mother Emanuel and that shooting, knowing that the year prior, as a divinity school student, I was in that sanctuary, and I had visited, because I was a part of a class. I visited that space. I met those people. I met that pastor, and then recognizing that the next Sunday, literally, I'll tell the story. The following week, no, 2 weeks after the shooting, a young man who's a friend of mine, white man, walked into the church. Young white man who I have never met before. And on that particular day, all of the men were teaching Bibles. They were, dispersed throughout. And so I then have to think about, how am I going to now approach him? And I go over, hi, my name is Kelly X, I'm the pastor here, and he says the names, and he says Ainka's name, and I'm like, oh, you can say Ainka, and I start putting things together. I recognize that you're this student. Oh, okay. And on that day, actually began a friendship with Joe Sharon, to the point that was able to be on, I was at I wasn't at his ordination. I'm online, like, watching, excited, because he's my friend, but it wasn't until maybe a year or so later, I was like, Joe, when you walked into my church, you were terrified because of the experience that I just had. But if it had not been for, my needing to overcome that particular fear, allow me not just to work with him, but also to do a lot more work within the community because of the connections that we've made. And so I'm wondering about how recognizing what those outliers can be, but also, use my hands, how then do we overcome those while still being protective? Because I like this thing called breathing and being alive, and I want my congregants to be safe, and I want everyone, I don't want anyone to walk in here to harm us. So how do we balance that idea that there are folks who have radical ideology? And part of my thoughts, and almost halfway answer it, this idea of radical love being an idea. This is just my Christian thoughts. And so I'm throwing this out here. I'm interested in what you all have to say around that.
I guess I can take it on first. I can go from the perspective of the mentality of it. It's you just got to keep a level of sanity while also just understanding being vigilant. I think vigilance is a big word. When you're a protector naturally, and I think I may get away from the topic of oppressors and oppressed individuals, and just more so just goes as a person in this society. As a male, as a protector of my family, it's certain things that are just ingrained into me with my vigilance, like going into a restaurant. If I'm taking a young lady on a date, she may be having the time of her life, not knowing in my mind, I'm calculating where the exit, where do we need to sit? Is my back? What faith you have. You just have to have an understanding, at least I do, what be will be. We have to have a certain level of preparedness But understanding that life is just gonna be life. I don't take it to an extreme. Like I don't go into places like I'm just not going there. I'm avoiding it. Like life will be what it is. But just understanding that I need to do the most I can to protect those around me. So
I kind of want to challenge the framing of your question.
Come on, challenge me. Push back.
Because you frame these people as outliers. But then if we were to think about the framing of violence that Sekou had thought about, they are merely a byproduct of the ongoing invisibilized violence that we are experiencing daily. And this is just what we would call a very visible form. But when you think about, again, state-sanctioned violence, the murder of black and indigenous people, when you think about the militarized violence that happens outside of our view, oftentimes, when you think about the violence that we don't see inside the prisons, right? This is not a radical form of violence. As a matter of fact, I think even the idea that we call that radical just goes to show the levels in which the empire has insulated us from its violence elsewhere, right? And so I would go so far as to say that violence is the norm. And so it becomes a different framing when you recognize that this thing called white colonialism, capitalist colonialism, has been waged in a warlike way for 500 years. Then on the interpersonal level, it's like, no, this is structurally violent. And so as a result, being a person, a part of a oppressed class, for lack of better terms, I have to be, using Ty's terms, vigilant. So that doesn't mean, now what does that mean in person? That doesn't mean, again, I'm gonna freeze and not go anywhere I go, but also, if I understand that history viscerally, why would I feel, what makes me so, I should be worried about this illusion of safety. Like, because it's just like, why do you feel so disarmed? Because that's really what I think it is. I think it attributes to the psychological warfare, because how can you do such a thing to, let's use black people, engage in chattel slavery, Jim Crow, gentrification, redlining, and then yet you can somehow you can experience all that collectively, and then as an individual say, I feel safe. Like I don't like that is
Wow.
That is a form of, that's psychological warfare. It's a disarming. It's there is no threat despite this violence historically and in present and materially that's happening. So for me, part of engaging in a form of psychological self-defense before we even get to the material is recognizing these structures and the ways in which they enact violence on you, whether it's through an institution, through a law, through interpersonal exchange, and then saying, okay, what do I need to do to assert my bodily autonomy? Because for me, like looking at it from a place of dismantling patriarchy, this is a form of bodily autonomy. Self-defense is a form of bodily autonomy. Why would I take away that ability from any person? Thinking about it from a reproductive justice lens, like, why would I take that from any person? Why is that exclusive to a male body, right? I mean, like, we have so many cultures that are outside of the West that actually have traditions of non-men being warriors. Why is that something that the empire does in such a way to where we say it's only men, or it's only able-bodied people, for example? So, like, for me, it's seeing the danger in believing, seeing the danger behind the belief that there is safety under colonialism, under this violent structure.
Oh. So the picket fence isn't real, is what you're saying?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
This takes me to another place, which is going to actually make me flip what I just said prior to. And I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Sekou. Do you believe that sometimes black folks, people of color, choose nonviolence out of the fear of legal retribution when it comes to maybe the carrying of a gun or being able to have, like, in defense of, and I think in particular of like home, and in those particular, or even out in public spaces. Do you think that those things can be happening out of a fear of a legal retribution? Out of a fear of legal retribution?
Maybe, but the debate, that may be the case, but the debate around, and as I see it, with nonviolence and in the black community and globally that's kind of a minor debate, so to speak. I stated earlier that there are people who believe in principled nonviolence, a King, a James Lawson, and people believe in pragmatic nonviolence, and people believe in both. And then within, I just kind of want to emphasize that if you move beyond the Hollywood, but nonviolence as a narrative has been corporatized and it's been given a bourgeois orientation, which is not what it is. Within the nonviolent tradition, it's not just about these kind of debates about caring, it's about strategy and tactics, spectrum of allies, pillars of support, dilemma confrontations, constructive programs. If you're going to nonviolent training, you're learning this as part of this. In the same way that if you believe in, armed resistance, is not just about carrying a gun, it's about studying the terrain, strategy, supply chain.
My question.
See, all these things and so the debate with nonviolence is, that's kind of a minor debate, but there are some people who believe that falls into the debate of what's called pragmatic. There's some people who believe that nonviolence is a better alternative, not the only one, but a better one because it's more pragmatic. And they do have some moral justification for it, and I just kind of want to walk you through why some of the challenges that they face as to why they may come to that conclusion, that a shooting war, there are people, innocent people that are going to be caught in the crossfire. They call it caught in the crossfire. How does one deal with that? How does one deal with the moral injury? That, Frantz Fanon was clear that violence can be a psychological liberation, but some of the other folks will say that even if it's justified, violence can create a moral injury. If you're in a shooting war that lasts beyond 3 or 4 days, there's a supply issue. It's not just about buying weapons and bullets and finding the money to do that, but food, water, safe houses, okay? Right. One of the reasons why General Lee surrendered in Appomattox was because Ulysses Grant cut off his food. He actually had the weapons to fight a guerrilla campaign for another year. If North Nashville were to rise up and be involved in a shooting war, right, could that last beyond a week? But what if they cut off the food supply, communication system, water supply? How do you get bullets into the process? Now, King did talk about this. It's not talked about. I have a speech where King said, I understand what's going on in the so-called slums, but these are the questions. It can't be sustained. There are other considerations. Is the terrain favorable? And here's a catch. Even in armed revolutions, and I've looked at them, I supported some of the, even armed revolutions, anti-colonial movements, sexual violence is a major issue. And don't think that just because you're on the side of liberation struggles, that you're immune to having sexual violence be a central part of armed revolutions. There are some folks, in fact, I had a female student who did 3 tours in Iraq, who did a couple tours in Iraq and had sexual assault against her 3 times, and said that it's a war. There's a term for it. But so there's some research. There's a researcher, Erin R. White, who unfortunately she passed away before a major book came out. But she interviewed African women independence revolutionary fighters who experienced high intensity sexual violence, not just against the oppressor, but against some of their own soldiers because of what war hysteria, what's called military hysteria, does. And then what about internecine conflict? There were real battles in SNCC, real battles between Bob Moses and others, Lawrence Guyot and others. There are real battles between the Panther Party, the Oakland Panther Party, and the New York Panther Party had a pretty vicious fight It's partly I think triggered by I'm not a fan of Eldridge, so. But the Panther Us organization. What's the difference between a SNCC and SLC fight, or this internal SNCC fight, versus a Panther Us fight? It's the availability of and the willing to use guns. So these are real issues, and these are not issues where like okay, you can't just like articulate the Southern movement as bourgeois preachers coming to this conclusion because they're afraid to pick up guns. Ralph Abernathy was a World War II veteran. Hosea Williams was a World War II veteran, I think wounded in World War II. For real. Medgar Evers was a World War II veteran. So these issues are part of. So to go back to your question about is someone afraid of the legal ramifications of carrying a gun? Maybe, right? But the state, the government, the state, the apparatus, the whole ecosystem is going to be leveraged against people who resist white supremacy and capitalism, regardless of they use violence, armed resistance, but also, right, they had 25 bombings, I think, in Macomb, Mississippi, or 25 fires set up, also against people who use nonviolence. The state apparatus is going to always be, for the most part, arrayed against us. So we can't assume that someone's pragmatic choice to use nonviolence or someone's other choice to use violence can be explained away by simplistic arguments.
Interject. I think during the civil rights movement, it was the nonviolence training African Americans walking across the Selma Bridge that really woke up a lot of white Americans. And if there had just been violence against violence, you guys would have lost.
Thanks.
And this violence begets more violence.
It's not true. Because I know for a fact, like even with black women and slavery, getting out of slavery, they start burning everything up. They use weapons that didn't need bullets, right? And as far as like the civil rights, I talk to older people, and you're older, you might not be as old as the person I talk to. But they had two groups in that time period, and people had communities where they came together and whichever group, like they have a meeting and say we're gonna go this way, whatever way, they gonna all go the same way, but it was two groups, right? Like the Stokey Carmichael, or you call him Corny Touré. Later when he slowed down, but when he was Corny Touré, he say, hey buddy, got a match, because like if you blew up this building, like a piece of it would go away. But if you burned it up, it'll burn crisp, right? Alright, but back to the civil rights, probably wasn't around, right? Those two groups, and what happened with those two groups, alright, you had a lot of W2 veterans, like the Big Slide, and then you had the Nation of Islam veterans, who the Black Panther Party came out of, and then you had the Vietnam veterans, right? So what was happening is a lot of black people put in
Rifle
the streets,
clubs.
and they started killing white supremacists. They're not going to say, hey, I killed the white supremacists and report it, right? So that's not going to get recorded in history, right? So what they did was, like I know Martin Luther King is a good brother. He used to be a Republican. And then the president at that time was a Democrat, right? And what happened is a lot of people went and got these marches and got beat up, right? So you got two. Some people want to do the nonviolent, and then some people want to have their own stuff and fight back. And so people fighting back. So that's what happened. The people, like a lot of white supremacists, was like getting killed in the streets, and then the government was like, well, you know, this is going to get it started riots. We want to take over the whole country. So what we're going to do is we're not going to not like that, like how an informant gets paid off. Like what's his name? There's a guy that everybody, Al Sharpton. You on YouTube, you look Al Sharpton.
Well, let me.
Mixed with his own voice.
He was.
This is. I know. So, I want to.
They got beat up. They got a whole bunch of jobs. Like all the people in that age, like maybe like they was in college, right? And they counted off as that was a college thing or whatnot. But this is common sense, right?
Well, let me.
If you beat me up for talking too much in here, that would not give me it. Like
But
I want to,
okay.
look, I do too.
I want,
We have panelists and they are mic, they can't hear, they can't hear.
I want to.
beyond, yes. But, yeah. Well,
And
go for it.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I wasn't saying anything. Go ahead.
well, I want to say something real
Yeah, go
quick,
ahead.
just in response to, I feel like what you said was the perfect example of what we've been talking about the oppressed, and should violence, in response to violence, be justified. And you said on the Salem Bridge that if we would have met them with violence, that we would have lost. Why is that assumed? If we had the proper weapons and the same amount of force that could come back to that group, why is it assumed that we would have lost that fight, meeting violence with violence?
It was that you didn't have. You were poor.
Well, so this is the part that I will push back on, and I understand, so what I hear you talking about is choosing a tactic for the point of, for success. And what I've also heard in the midst of this conversation, that there are a number of different tactics that are coming on at the same time.
Yes.
And that while what is going forward is a nonviolent front, I say front as in what is being presented, not as a, but what is the narrative, but what is also happening during those times are also that there's defense that is happening. There are literally, I'm thinking about Deacons for Defense, that there are other folks that while they are in the moment, I don't know if I'm using the right one, pragmatic, nonviolent. So in the instance of as it pertains to this particular struggle, I will align with what the group is saying in order for us to have success. But there are also folks, and if you hit me,
Right.
that is this.
Right.
But also the other thing that is also happening is that this is also training. That those who are walking across this have made a decision that this is the strategy that they're going to use.
Right.
And so in
self-defense.
that, that's where I wanted to move to the next question, is that in the same way that there are trainings that are happening that are happening at Fisk in the 60s, that are happening, and that actually are just happening now. As far as it pertains to nonviolent training, there's also training that is happening for those who are going to who choose to have the option of using self-defense, because regardless of which tactics are used, if you are not properly trained, that it's not going to fully work. You're going to be able, and so while I have learned a lot personally about what it means, and I say kids because apparently now I am old, but that high school and college students we're sitting and reenacting what would happen if we sat at this counter, and how do I create enough restraint in myself not to hit this person back. I'm interested in, and so I know about those trainings. And I know that there's more than just that as well, as far as learning around the philosophical understanding, so that you both have it in your body, in your mind, and in your spirit, so that you can then bring it forth. I'm interested in what does training look like for those who desire to also have this physical, more self-defense stance. And I'm interested, Madam President.
I'll say a little something, then I'll throw you the mic.
Okay.
Violence working both ways makes the law, makes the racist, makes the bully more inclined to keep the peace. See, when you know that I'll come right back at you the way you come to me, or I might just know that we already have beef, so when I see you, what we like to say in the black community, it's on sight.
It's on sight.
That doesn't mean I'm waiting for you to pull your gun out and kill me. I'm not waiting for you to raise your hand up and smack me. I know we got beef. And I know your MO. I know how you move. I know you don't care about going to jail. I know you don't, because you probably got a lawyer or a judge or somebody that's gonna get you out, where I may not have those, resources. But Robert F. Williams and my Negroes with Guns, who helped started one of the first black rifle clubs. He was a vet that trained his community, and they fought back against the KKK, and guess what it did? It slowed down the KKK attacking black folks in Monroe, North Carolina. You know, and it caused other black communities to begin to have rifle clubs, black rifle clubs, and to begin to train their communities based on the knowledge that's already there, based on the experience that's already there.
I wanted to throw something at, didn't he get a charter for the National Rifle Association?
Yes, he was the first one to, with the NRA, and then they started the NAACP, and they got mad at him because he was using funds to make sure that the people were trained. And then you had those blacks that opposed and wanted the nonviolent movement. But to be honest, just in 2022, I don't know what a nonviolent movement is. I don't know how to train for that. I'm not practicing sitting nowhere for none of y'all to smack me around, to smack my kids around, to pull no guns on me, to set me up for failure. None of that. For me, I look at it, it's over for that. Violence, again, when working on both sides, then here comes your peace.
Yeah, so I think to answer your question about what training looks like, there's a lot. I want to start off by saying that there's a lot of deep misinformation that comes with this training. It's, at least from my perspective, it's about the preservation of life. Like the first option isn't, oh, I'm gonna go shoot somebody or I'm gonna go attack somebody. It's,
I gotta stay alive.
This is a tool. Right? But that is not my first resort. That is my last resort. Meaning, if I have other means pragmatically to avoid a confrontation, I'm going to use it. Like, for context, I'm both a martial arts instructor and a firearms instructor. One thing that I tell my students is, even legal constraints considered, if there's no reason to engage in violence, don't do it. Right? Avoidance. Sometimes the greatest martial artist is the person who can avoid a fight. Right? So for me, it's the thing that doesn't get talked about in our hyper sensationalized, violence obsessed media is that when it comes to this type of training, even when you are engaged in armed self-defense or unarmed self-defense, the first thing is like, okay, if you can win, the easiest way to win this fight is how you win this fight. If that includes not lifting a finger, cool. Because there's multiple dimensions to this beyond the physical, right? There's the psychological, there's so many social aspects. That's the first thing. Now within that, when you start talking about the physical skills, and you learn this from any firearm instructor that's worth learning from, you are not only learning how a firearm works, right? But you understand the ramifications of what it means to use it. Like, that is a very serious issue when you are using a firearm, regardless of the political context, right? So understanding the ramifications of that, and also what's not talked about enough is the ability to heal, despite how violent Western society is. You look at many martial traditions, there's sort of like somewhat of a duality to them. There's this ability to destroy and break down body, people, et cetera, but there's also this practice of healing, whether it's stop the bleed, CPR, AED, non-traditional methods, Qigong, et cetera, acupressure, what have you. So there's levels to this. There's those skills, and then there's the unarmed skills. There's the armed skills, because I'm a believer that, and it's not a believer, it's a scientific fact in the martial arts. A weapon that you use is an extension of your body. So if you don't have control of your body, I don't care what you have, a gun, a knife, hands, it's not gonna be wielded if you don't have control. So like a lot of what's not talked about in this training is the ability to control the amount of violence or attacks or defense that you can use, and you don't use it in a way that's unwieldy, that's uncontrollable. It's what level of force do I need to use in order to neutralize the threat, right? And neutralize doesn't always mean end of life. I would actually encourage you not to do that, right? If you don't have to, right? And so I say all that to say that there's so many dimensions of this, and that's just the physical aspects. We're not talking about the level of study that you have to engage in to fully understand these dynamics. Sekou brought it up in so many ways, studying terrain, even on an interpersonal level, studying terrain, or what we would call situational awareness. Does it make sense to engage
Emotional
in these things?
intelligence.
Emotional intelligence. You know, being able to read the room, you know what I mean? And so there's so much of that goes into that. But to Sekou's point, just like with nonviolence, violence is so much so. Even forms of armed self-defense are corporatized and framed in this really reductive way in Hollywood. It's like we always get the portrayal of like some Rambo, oh, we're gonna shoot stuff up. No, it's much more complex than that, and there's a lot of physical, social, psychological, ethical implications and training and contemplation that goes into that for anybody who takes that serious. So I do want to like note that like there's a lot of study and pre-training and then training that goes into this.
Pre-training.
Pre-training is in, I mean, if you were in a, especially if you were in a politicized formation, political education, for example, would be that, what I consider pre-training.
Thank you. I've got, unless someone has something to add, I've got one more question.
Well, I would just
Add to it.
those folks who study nonviolence, they debate the so-called radical flank effect, and the radical flank effect is, you know, Malcolm coming into Selma and telling Coretta Scott King that if they don't want to deal with your husband, then they're going to deal with me, which I think is all performative. I don't think there's any way that Malcolm, if you know Selma in '65 and know the goons that were on the street, they were not afraid of Malcolm, and they could marshal the state apparatus, the state troopers, with weapons galore. And in '64 you had I believe in '64, '63 you had a riot in Harlem because the police murdered a black kid. You had Nation of Islam folks that were murdered in Watts or Los Angeles, South LA by the police. Brutal. And Malcolm asked, I think, Elijah for permission to respond, and Elijah was like, heck no, because and the chief at the time, Parker, it was the Chief Parker. Okay, Chief Parker. He was the worst of the worst. He would have been prepared for them, and so there was that caused tension between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. Globally, there's a debate about the radical flank effect. Does it work? Does the threat of Maoist revolutionaries, is a state more likely to respond to nonviolent activists? And it's inconclusive. But I would lean in the American experience. For black folks, I would probably lean and say outside of a few anomalies, I really don't think so. I really don't think that because black folks before the movement of the 50s, black folks knew how to shoot. Every black family in the South had a gun and could shoot.
Yep.
They were not kids on the street firing off over dope. They were guys that coming out of World War I that had to hunt. They could shoot. They were hardy folks, tough folks, bad mamma jammers. Hosea Williams called himself, quote unquote, the thug of the SCLC. Coming out of World War II, I think he got a Purple Heart or something. So it's a more complicated history, but to say that it's, you know, if you have a, I understand, if you have a gun, they're afraid of these black guys over here with guns, these black folks over here with guns, and in order to respond to the black folks over here with guns, then they're going to make a concession to these folks. I don't think that there's much in the history of black resistance movements that if one really digs deep down that will validate that point. In a few circumstances, maybe yes, and it doesn't. If you believe in armed resistance, it doesn't take away from the fact. It doesn't take away from, if you believe that armed resistance is legitimate, it doesn't take away from the legitimacy of the armed resistance. Now, what may have happened was this. What may be more likely is that folks who took up arms in urban rebellions, that bourgeois black activists, bourgeois black ministers maybe came in and said, we're more peaceful to deal with us. That may have happened on the other hand, but I just think that it's subject for debate, but I don't think that it's as clear of a story as and just to kind of point out about the movement of I'm documenting right now, the white supremacy was not prepared for what hit them from the 50s or the 60s just in the South. There was extreme brutality, racial terrorism targeted against African Americans. But the level of protests and the level of sit-ins and pray-ins and stand-ins and swim-ins and you know, a Tuscaloosa, Alabama sanitation workers strike, Atlanta workers strike, even in the midst of extreme violence, and no doubt about it, black folks beat them. Working class black folks beat them. They beat them. Now, we could retell that story a certain way that, well, it was these folks over here and these folks there, but at that moment in time, against the extreme messages of extreme acts of racial terrorism, everyday black folks beat white supremacy at that moment in time. And as I believe they did it non-violently. Now, people can disagree with that, and I'm definitely willing to disagree with it. I believe mostly non-violently. But that's the reason why the story is being told differently, because no one in American history would say that working class black folks beat white supremacy in a way that even Ulysses Grant couldn't do it.
Fascinating.
Fascinating. That takes me to kind of this last question that I have that you all already have. I'm wondering, what is the road forward? Knowing that I would probably even make the argument that every person at this table, even with 3 people taking the same stance as far as self-defense, probably don't still take the same exact way in the way you enact that self-defense. But knowing that, I believe with my whole heart that everyone who sits at this table has a desire for freedom and justice for black folks, and that in that freedom and justice also creates freedom and justice for all folks. Now, what that looks like might be different, and sometimes justice don't always look like freedom for everybody. But I'm wondering how then do we collaborate with folks who may not agree with our strategies and our tactics, but hopes for our same outcome?
Well, I think for every, and to use this analogy, and I'm all nuances considered, for every person that was committed to getting on the streets throughout the South, or in certain pockets of the South that chose not to engage in nonviolence, there was a deacon of defense that was rolling around and was committed to a certain act should there be sort of a deviation from a plan. So for me, and let's be clear, like again, when we talk about this, I understand the political sort of diversion when it comes to the use of tactics and whether it's pragmatic versus moral. But the reality is that for me at least, I'm a believer in, of a both and, right? Like for me, I think, and maybe that falls under pragmatism. For me, I'm a person that believes in the utilization of certain nonviolent tactics, and then when needed, and I know need is a point of debate, but when needed, engaging in form of self-defense, whether it be interpersonal, whether it be organized, right? I think that to me, that's open for on the table for me. I think we have to be diligent about, regardless of where we land, is getting clear on what narratives have we been fed that are corporatized, that are a byproduct of a generation or two of misinformation by state forces, whether it be COINTELPRO or other forces that want to misremember history, right, and not acknowledge those nuances, whether it be within the nonviolent wing or the armed wing. for me, it's being grounded in that history, as much of that complexity as possible, and then using that and an assessment of current conditions to determine what is best. Because I think to combat this structure that we see now in the 21st century is going to require some new strategies. It's going to be waged on different platforms. I'm a personal believer that the fight for liberation in so many ways is going to be digital, because in the 21st century, because we live in a mostly computerized world where privacy is a figment of our imagination, right? So the conditions, the terrain is shifted in some ways, not entirely, but in some ways. So I think for me, it's being open to a variety of different tactics, and getting clear on, at least on ideology and where you're trying to go. Because I think because of so much misinformation in this age of social media too, I think there's a lot of unclearness on people's political direction and ideology. So I think a large part of this is getting clear on what we want. And with that, where does that overlap? And then where does that diverge?
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond? Yes.
What the question was, what does freedom and justice look like? Was that?
How do we collaborate with those who don't
that.
share the same strategies and tactics?
Well, again, like I said earlier, to me, self-defense is about forming strategies, and then violence is one of the tools that can be used, just as nonviolence can. Everybody has a role, and everybody has a place. If our ultimate goal is justice, is freedom, and especially Black folks within the Black community, we have that goal, then if you're not for guns or use of weapons to get your point across, that's fine, but we need medics. You know, we need people that are growing food. We need people that are trained in survivor skills, because that is a part of self-defense, you know, being able to actually survive, self-preservation. So don't judge how the other person's trying to get there, but see how can we use that when needed, because violence may not always be the answer, or, you know, taking up arms are the people that want to fight physically. But during that time, while you're gardening, while you're feeding the kids, taking care of the kids, while the elders are out doing what they do, while the community is at church, then we have security. You know, they ain't just walking around wanting to shoot people and things like that. They're just prepared and ready for whatever. But we also need those that can help with the psychological side of it. You know, the thinkers, the critical thinkers, those that want the conflict resolution, those that are gonna stake out the joint, you know, see what's going on, and contribute to the plan in that way. Okay, this is the best setup, these are the best times, we have these relationships, we're building networks, we have allies, those are their jobs. So everybody has a role that they can play to get there. To be honest, I don't know what freedom looks like. I don't. You know, it sounds like something that's good, and it's like heaven almost. We talk about this afterlife, and it's sad to say I feel like that's what freedom is, the afterlife. Like, I honestly can't say I know what freedom and justice. I can't even focus on that. I'm trying to focus on survival.
Can I touch on that a little bit?
Touch on it.
Just a little bit.
Teach.
Brother Denzel, he made a great point. He said, what do we want? Sister Tanea, I don't know what freedom looks like. That right there is big, because that's something I ask people. We're all humans. We all have our own perspectives. When we're, in dialogue, we're trying to understand another individual's point. The question I always ask people when it comes to politics, when it comes to freedom, especially, Black individuals, what does freedom look like for you? So the two questions I ask is, you have to ask yourself. I say, do you truly want your own self-sustaining society, or do you just want a place of comfort in this system? Because there's a difference. Some people, again, we're all humans, we all have our own perspective. One individual may just want to live in a society where they don't have to worry about systemic racism. They don't have to worry about walking outside of their doors, knowing their child may just be driving to meet a friend and he gets interrogated by the police, and that ends with a homicide, a murder. That may be the society you want to live in. It may be one where you have this belief in American democracy, and one day we will fix it. If that's your belief, okay. You know what side of the fence you stand on. But again, I ask people, do you believe, what's your definition of freedom? Is freedom your own self-sustaining society? Because if it is, how you're going about your freedom is not going to be the same way that other individual is going about theirs. It really comes down to two things. It's reform and revolution. Those are the two things. It's either reform, we're going to try to make this work from the inside out, or you're going to say this system will not operate and will not meet the needs that we have in order to live, and we have to abolish it. One's very radical. One is, we can maybe work. We can maybe make it work, and that's a big thing for me. You have to. Do you believe in reform, or are you a revolutionary? And that'll answer a lot of things for you. Because revolution is a touchy subject. It's something that still Black Americans were not ready for. If we look at the Haitian Revolution alone, there was something they did that was fairly radical on those plantations before they could move forward on their oppressors. We have to get rid of all the Black individuals here who don't agree with what we want to do moving forward in our idea of freedom. That's a touchy subject. So a big thing on that is deciding what's freedom for you, because how I go about it may not be the same, but we still can all operate in the same parameter. Not to go too long on this one, but again, like me, I'm a private security professional. A big thing, there's a lot of local Nashville political organizations. They may reach out for security work and whatnot. I can take my skill set of expertise. I don't have to agree with your standpoint to help. To do what's necessary. Like Sister Tanea said, everyone has a role. If we're speaking on it from a revolutionary perspective, everyone has a role. Someone has to make the propaganda. Someone still has to take care of the children. Someone has to build the vehicles. Somebody has to build the databases, the software for how we're going to, use our digital platforms. Someone has to actually be the frontline soldier. So I think when it comes to our communities, we get caught up in so much of who's on the front lines, who's the freedom fighter, when it's 100 people and it's a million different roles to play. So kind of just gotta find where you fit in regards to the struggle and just do it.
Well, I would say that, again, I don't have a right to tell someone not to defend themselves or their family. If the police jump down their throat, the police come. I've had police come in my yard. I mean, for real, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, no help. I know what that means, literally. Got kid in my house, So no one has a right to. I don't have the right to tell someone that they cannot defend themselves in those kinds of interpersonal interactions with another individual or with the state. Likewise, I think there's a talk that King gave. You can find it on YouTube. It's a brilliant conversation where he does talk about the need at times for international peacekeepers or people in Arkansas, 101st Airborne had to be called in to tell the National Guard to stand down, and how that is a distinct issue. There's a debate between King and Thich Nhat, the Vietnamese Buddhist, about self-immolation and whether or not that's violence versus non-violence. But I think where I'm trying to take the conversation, given my my limited experiences, is how do we answer this question within the role of organizations and coalitions being on the offensive, trying to achieve political objectives? And that's different than Sekou Franklin, whether Sekou Franklin carries a gun or not carry a gun. I've had my close family members have jumped on me for not having a gun. Bad too. So if you think about how the collaboration and so forth works on dealing with the so-called objective conditions, that's a different issue, because that is a political objective, in the same way that the Cuban Revolution or Angola or I can go on, they had political objectives. And I think like on that issue, I do think that the principal leaders, when it comes to addressing a political objective, should be clear. Do they want to embrace armed resistance as a principal mobilizing motive? Not whether somebody in the group is carrying a gun in the back or under the chair, but as a mobilizing motive, or whether or not they want to use nonviolence. And to think that that argument is being imposed upon us by white supremacy or by different framing mechanisms. No, that was an argument. That was a debate that the Panthers had at Laney College. That was a debate that Cesar Chavez had in United Farm Workers. That is, that do we use violence or nonviolence as a principal mobilizing motive to achieve political objectives, to deal with the objective conditions facing our community. That is a fundamentally different question than whether or not Sekou Franklin is going to have a gun and is going to prevent a police officer from coming up in his house. And I do think that organizations should be clear, emphatically, that is this our principal mobilizing motive to achieve this objective. Right? Now, there are secondary factors to that. So that means, what are the secondary factors? Somebody in your organization may decide to do that. Somebody in your organization may be pulled over by police and they fight police back. There's so-called nonviolent discipline in the way that there's so-called military discipline. Sometimes we break it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's a daily struggle. None of us comes across pure. But as a mobilizing principle, what is the primary mobilizing principle in an organization? I do think that should be discussed, should be debated, should be decided upon. And there are, at times that doesn't mean that one is perfect. So as an example, as Denzel knows, when we were responding to the murder of Jacques Clemens and his family, and do folks, as a principal motive, right, achieve an objective through armed resistance, right? Well, maybe, but maybe not, right? Can we fend off MMPD, right? Can we fend off the National Guard?
Right.
This shooting came out of Casey Holmes.
Yeah.
If we carry armed resistance, they're not going to go after the middle class professor who got a pension sitting on 20 years. Maybe they might, but they're for sure going to go after Casey Holmes, who can't afford bail.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. Right? Think about those folks who got arrested in the 2020 George Floyd protests.
Right.
Some of the activists, Denzel, you know them, said the folks who got bail were the folks that had the connections. Right? Think about if I got to go tell somebody's mama that I'm that their son got killed in the streets fighting politically, right? And I had to make that decision. Right? Right. That's a heavy burden to carry. Bob Moses broke down when Herbert Lee got killed, and he was a nonviolent. Bob Moses was about as nonviolent resistance as you can. Herbert Lee got murdered and shot in the back of the head, and Bob Lee, and he embraced Bob Lee. Bob Moses almost never recovered from that. So what I'm saying is that on that issue of this is not just about, for me, this is not just about armed defense. My stepfather passed away. I think he was a Vietnam War. He was a South Asian, I'll put it that way, deep in there, military guy. You know what my mother did a couple weeks ago? She took gun permit lessons because she's by herself. Now I don't have a right to tell her, you know what? If a person runs up in her home, Sekou Franklin, this guy who believes in nonviolence, might be down there, strapping up, but that's different than this issue of dealing with the objective conditions in our community.
Yeah.
Gloria Richardson, Robert Williams, Huey Newton. That's why the story of the Panthers is not the Black Panther Party for self-defense. It is not. The story of the Panthers is the Black Panther Party emphasis on party. We're here to achieve our political objectives, right, that is based upon an ideological struggle. And that's different. So if we deal with the objective conditions in our community right now in Nashville, what are the objective conditions? Structural violence. Structural violence is affecting more black folks in Nashville than police killing black people in the back of the back head. We got folks being displaced.
Yep.
Right?
Food
We
deserts.
still have police harassment, right? We got evictions out the wazoo. We got data, but we got data on
Afford
this.
to work where you live.
We got defunding of schools. We got generational structural violence. How do we, whether we embrace violence or nonviolence, deal with the objectives, conditions in our community? And I'm just arguing that if I'm in a principal organization and we don't debate whether or not violence versus nonviolence should be our primary, like, purposeful motive, then we are really, I think, not. We're not doing. We're making ourselves vulnerable to agent provocateurs.
Yes.
We're making ourselves vulnerable to class-based issues. Like and when the repression happens, who's going to be repressed? Often the poor folk. We're making ourselves vulnerable to real consequential decisions that leadership must make. Leadership has to make a decision. If I use armed defense and my people get killed, who's going to pay for the funeral costs? Leadership has to make those kinds of decisions. If it was good, if Che had to make those decisions,
Then we have.
right? If they had to make those decisions in Angola and Nepal and the Mouse Rebellion in the Philippines, and on 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 and on, and we're up here saying we can't make those decisions that are a consequence of us trying to address the objective conditions facing our community. Now, again, for me, I'm just saying that the leadership core in these organizations should debate. And if separate if people have to go one way versus the other way, then that's that. It is what it is. But then they just kind of smother the debate or not think it's that critical or not important. Well, we can't say it's not important because the Panthers. We know it got so deep for the Panthers. The Panthers, there was an underground group. There was an underground armed resistance group that the Panthers said no, they're not even. Panthers said that underground armed resistance group is gonna damage working class black folks. Why? Because the only way that working class black folks will defend armed resistance if they see you above ground. They call it above ground vanguardism, right? So there's a whole lot more to that.
Yeah.
But they debated it. They didn't run away from it. They debated it. I'm sorry for going. In fact, the Panthers, some of the Panthers said the reason why they chose armed resistance was because, from their perspective, living in an urban West Coast society. I'm from the West Coast. You may be figured out. Living in an urban West Coast society, from their perspective, I may disagree, but from their perspective, there was a nonviolent group, but nonviolent groups that weren't working. So this issue of you taking the armed resistance was very much explicit, and but I do want to make this one point if I can. This does not mean, by the way, that those of us who believe in nonviolence will not fight for the dignity of people who take up arms. I want to make sure I point it out.
That was the word.
King, I'll give you a couple examples. King joined at the executive committee level, joined a group in 1957. He was in his 20s. I think it was called Committee of Action on Africa. I have it. By 64, this group was supportive of primarily nonviolent, but African liberation. By 64, they embraced the Algerian resistance, and they embraced openly the primary organization in Algeria, in the Algerian Revolution, and that was a liberation, armed liberation group. And King's speeches, it's an edited volume by Cornel West. He has a King speech. He's supportive of anti-apartheid of South Africa, but he also says Angola. Okay, right. So, and then King says we should push for an international nonviolent army. So he's trying to frame a meta-narrative around nonviolence, while at the same time understanding that I can't deny these people
take
of
the
their,
autonomy of others.
yeah. In the same way that Ralph Abernathy, who took over for King, he's flying over to San Jose, California, or Oakland, Bay Area, California, and he's speaking at the Free Angela Davis Committee. Right? You see what I'm saying? But it can work in multiple. I'm sorry, it can work. I can go on. I can
So
tell you
this is
story
a-
after story after story after
So
story.
this is what I hear.
But
I wanna-
I'm sorry for going off.
No,
but,
you're
I can-
good. What I hear is that conversation is necessary.
Well,
that,
no, yeah.
Being in communication, that being able to be in spaces where you're hearing different
Well, no,
viewpoints
right-
to be able
right
to
now-
make a real decision.
Right now, some movements are, and I wouldn't say I don't know about blacks, but some so-called anti-globalization movements are splintering because they start off non-violently, and then people come in and talk about the diversity of tactics, which is basically taking up armed resistance.
Right.
And but what I'm saying is that groups shouldn't assume that these things can fit organically. Without there being intra-organizational struggle.
No, definitely.
Yes,
And so that, but what that is, and when I say dialogue, that there has to be intense conversation, deep thought, pushback in order to, so that it is not a decision that is made for. I think oftentimes the decision, we look at a Dr. King, that's what he did. So that's what everybody's supposed to do. And in that instance, it's not actually a choice that is made, and oftentimes not fully understanding the fullness of his argument.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the fullness of of not just his argument, the entire movement, and that movement is beyond even just what's happening in the South there, but is connected to freedom struggles throughout the world.
Yeah.
And so and the need for conversation.
Yeah, I mean, if they cross Edmund Pettus Bridge against the Alabama State Troopers, and their main headquarters, if you go to Selma, is in the Carver Housing Projects. If you've ever been to Selma, within two main churches, and this is the 1960s, and it's literally in the housing projects, right? And if they get beaten up over the head, then give me a strategy if you believe in armed resistance. Give me a strategy for how I got to talk to somebody's mama.
After that happens.
No,
Now-
not after that happened, in which you are making the decision.
I see.
politically.
Yes.
You are making the decision. You're the general. You're the sergeant.
So
You're
the
the
possibility of
captain.
taking away the autonomy of others.
You're the captain. You're the person in a military front that is making the argument that in order to achieve political objectives, people will die. That's not about you. That's about you possibly having to deal with somebody's brother.
So this is, we can literally talk about this all night, but we don't have all night
Yeah,
to talk
right.
about this.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is to thank each of you coming and sharing your perspectives, sharing your knowledge and your wisdom, and our ability to have this conversation. I want to thank our guests that are present here physically, and those who are on the internet for taking the time to sit, to listen, to offer questions that we did not get a chance to get to or ask. And most importantly, that we continue to have the conversations, that we continue to talk to each other, and that we are reading. And I think that's the part that I heard that was most important, that those who are sitting here who take the stance that they take do not take this lightly.
Right.
But that they are studying, that they have spent time looking at what has happened, that I like to call, we got to be Sankofa, we got to look back and see what has already been done as we prepare as we go forward. I want to thank you all so much for being here. I know that there was something else that you wanted to offer, but do we want to do anything in this moment from our amazing executive director, Reverend Sandra Talbert? I would be remiss if I don't take the opportunity to thank her for her presence, and I know that she had something special. Sounds good.
So, thank you, panelists. This has been an amazing time, and thank you all. And we apologize to our audience that sent in a couple questions that we didn't get a chance to get to because the discussion was so rich. But we're going to ask the panelists of them, and we'll try and get that information out. But we're at our time frame right now. But we thank you all so much for coming out. He said, grab the mic, and I was trying not to do that, and that was the same thing that I told somebody else earlier. But I like to, because 9 times out of 10, sometimes this is someone's first time being here.